It's recording. Okay, great.
Denise, you got to get off mute.
Thanks.
Oh,
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
It's so wonderful to be at a CRC voting rights Havara. This is like everything I love all in one place. I got CRC, I got my rabbi here, I got voting rights. I'm pretty much in heaven right here. So, and all of you, thank you for your interest. And Chris, thank you for your taking the initiative to set up a voting rights Havara, and I'm super excited about it. I'm super excited for CRC to be part of this effort, because we know that fighting to protect the right to vote is an enormous part of our bigger fight for justice and our work for Tikkun Olam, to repair the world, because voting really gets to the very core of who we value in society. And when we make voting more difficult, when we target particular communities because we don't like what they have to say and make voting harder for them, and when we place barriers and hurdles in the way of those communities to be able to speak their truth, to have a voice, it sends a profound message about who we value as a society. And CRC has something to say about that. CRC historically has had something to say about people that society tends to silence and censor and put off to the side. And in fact, CRC was born around this notion of this idea of human dignity and the right of all people to be able to participate, the right of all people to have dignity. So it's very, very much an honor and a privilege to be able to be with CRC, my temple, here today. And I do have some slides I'm going to share, because those of you who have seen me speak before know I bring my professor hat to the table a fair amount here. Oh, thank you so much, Autumn. But I'm really so excited to see you all here. I'm so excited to see CRC staff here, and I'm just incredibly honored and thrilled that our lead rabbi is here as well. So thank you for being here, Rabbi Talvi. Oopsie. Okay, so I'm going to share some slides here to kind of give us a little bit of a context. I think my part will be maybe around 10 to 15 minutes, because I really want to make sure that there's plenty of time for us to have a robust discussion and talk through and have questions and answers. So I'm here tonight in my role as the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, which is a nonpartisan statewide network of advocates who work to protect the right to vote. That's really the mission of the organization, although it's a little bit broader than that. We work to protect the right to vote with particular focus on communities of color, low-wage workers, seniors, young voters, voters with disabilities, and sexual minorities, because these populations tend to be targeted for voter suppression efforts, and these are also the populations that tend to face the greatest barriers to the ballot. For those of you who don't know me, I think I do know almost all of you here. I'm a voting rights lawyer. I've been doing this for 25 years. As Chris mentioned, I started my civil rights legal career actually at a law firm, and then at the ACLU as their legal director here in Missouri. And after that, I spent the next 13 years until last year at Advancement Project National Office in Washington, D.C., where I was the national director of the Voting Rights Program. And Advancement Project's a national racial justice organization that has a movement lawyering focus that I think is particularly relevant to how CRC shows up in spaces, because it really is about building power building power in communities who too often go unheard. And the vote is a vehicle to doing that. The vote is a vehicle to being able to build power, to seek accountability, right? So the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition was founded 15 years ago in 2006, which was the year that Missouri first attempted to enshrine a strict photo ID requirement to vote. And at that time, Missouri was one of just a handful of states going down this voter suppression path. Today, of course, 47 of the 50 states have restrictive voting bills pending. But in 2006, Missouri was among 3 states, along with Georgia and Indiana, to pass a strict photo ID law. And this coalition came together to fight it and to block it. We actually filed a lawsuit, went all the way up to the Missouri Supreme Court and won. The Missouri Supreme Court struck the law down. Yet that didn't stop Missouri lawmakers from continuing to attempt to enshrine now unconstitutional photo ID requirements to vote. And they continue to do so with each passing year, also attempting to change the Constitution to make it permissible. And so just step back and think about that for just a moment. You've got a law that the highest court in our state has said is unconstitutional. It violates the fundamental right to vote. And lawmakers who took an oath to protect and defend that very Constitution continue to come back year after year and say, well, we want this measure so bad. If it's unconstitutional, instead of maybe we shouldn't pass an unconstitutional law, their response was, well, then let's change the Constitution. And in fact, that is ultimately what happened. We staved it off a few times. We brought lawsuits in 2006, in 2011, and 2012. The measure did finally pass in 2016, and a new version of a photo ID law was enshrined in 2017. We filed another lawsuit and got it struck down again. And yet here they are, yet again, 15 years later in 2021, yet again attempting to enshrine those same unconstitutional photo ID requirements. And so our coalition just kept meeting because the need was there. And over the years, the need has grown and grown exponentially. And right now, we are in what I would call the greatest crisis of our democracy since the post-Reconstruction era, I would suggest to you. There are more restrictive voting bills pending in states around the country now than at any other time than in that post-Civil War era. And the rationale behind them is actually not dissimilar from the rationales in that post-Civil War era. After the Civil War opened the doors to voting for a huge swath of Americans, 4 million, and then, remember, women weren't allowed to vote, 4 million African-American men after the Civil War. It changed the state of play, particularly in the South, where African-Americans were, in many places, a majority or a near majority of the population. And they ended up teaming up with progressive whites to get people elected to office. And they showed up and they voted extraordinarily so. And the assaults on the right to vote, the legislative assaults on the right to vote in the decade that followed were a direct backlash to that robust turnout. What we are seeing here today in 2021, in the more than 360 restrictive voting bills that have been introduced in 47 states around the country, is that same kind of backlash. It is the backlash to the robust registration and turnout, particularly by voters of color, low-wage workers, and young voters in the 2020 election cycle. And so make no bones about it, that these fights for the right to vote are truly about the ability of people to continue to have a say in their own lives and their own destinies. And so the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition's work is as relevant as ever. We undertake our mission through 4 buckets of work. Through policy advocacy. We're very heavy in the policy work right now. We lead the identification and tracking of voting bills in the Missouri legislature amongst our coalition partners. And we also lead campaigns, advocacy campaigns to advance proactive voting reforms at the national level that will have a distinct impact on voters in Missouri. And I'm going to tell you about several of those bills in just a moment. We also undertake our work through legal advocacy and litigation. As I've mentioned, I'm a voting rights attorney and do a lot of work. I brought a lot of lawsuits under the Voting Rights Act, lots of lawsuits challenging photo ID laws. Here in Missouri, we in the last year brought several lawsuits to ensure that voters could safely cast ballots amid the pandemic. We brought lawsuits challenging the photo ID requirements, lawsuits challenging notary requirements during a pandemic, and lawsuits on behalf of Black and faith organizations, including Jewish organizations. The National Council of Jewish Women was a plaintiff, challenging unfair absentee voting rules amid the pandemic last year, and actually got a preliminary injunction that ultimately got appealed before the election in 2020. The third bucket of work we do is voter education and engagement. And we are constantly at work producing things like these palm cards. We have palm cards that we release before every election so that they are current with the current state of the law. We produce toolkits, we do trainings, we do webinars. We have multiple voter education events every single week. And there really is something for everybody in this work because we know that in particular, education is critical. We are in a spate of misinformation right now about voting that is designed to confuse people and make it harder for them to cast a ballot. And so getting accurate and solid information is really key to empowering people to be able to exercise their own rights. And finally, fourth, our signature service program is that the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition also runs the nonpartisan statewide election protection efforts in Missouri in collaboration with our national partners who provide access to the 866 Our Vote election protection hotline. So you can see that here. We have the hotline live every election, and it's staffed by local attorneys here in Missouri. We partner with the Minority Bar Association. So these are several attorneys from the Mound City Bar Association. And you may recognize that room that they're sitting in if you look really closely, because yes, if you said it's the CRC multipurpose room, you'd be correct. And that's because Central Reformed Congregation has been a big part of this effort over the last decade by making its space available for the election protection legal command centers. Now, we stopped doing that in 2020 because of the pandemic. Everything went virtual and our command center became a big Zoom room. But we are, I really think it's important to thank CRC and recognize the role that CRC has played in ensuring that the attorneys and our poll monitors had a space to congregate and work on the issues that were coming into the hotline. And like I said, we have thousands of volunteers across the state. In the November 2020 elections, we had 1,500 volunteers monitoring polling places all across the state of Missouri. You may recognize a few of those faces as well, including St. Louis's newest mayor there, Tashara Jones. You may also recognize Ellen Alper, the CEO of the National Council of Jewish Women. There's Gina McLennan, the head of the Washington University Voter Access and Engagement Initiative, AJ Bockelman, former ED of Promo, who most recently was at Empower Missouri. I see Wesley Bell down there, a number of others. But I really want to underscore the importance of faith-based organizations getting involved in this fight. And Rabbi Talvi, I know you've heard this part of my presentation before, but it truly comes from the heart. We know that faith communities and faith leaders in particular have been a driving force of the civil rights movement in general, and for the movement for the right to vote in particular, right? And we see here rabbis marching with Martin Luther King to advance the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, right? And we know that leaders of faith, especially Jewish leaders and members of the Jewish community, remain heavily vested in this fight today. Here in St. Louis, the Jewish Community Relations Council of Metro St. Louis released a public policy statement in 2020 stating clearly and explicitly that the fight for the right to vote is a Jewish fight, is a fight that Jews are intended to undertake, that it is part of our commitment to tikkun olam, of repair of the world, for the very reasons that I sort of started this talk with, that the right to vote truly is about who matters. And it is about the fight for basic human dignity. And so not only is it's a way that we speak in a public sense, quite literally, we count you, right? We literally count you when you show up to vote. And so when the right to vote is denied or abridged for particular communities, particularly communities that we already shun and marginalize, and the message there is that you don't count, right? The right to vote is also how we exercise self-determination over our own destinies. It's how we speak in the public sense to say what we want. It's how we hold our leaders accountable. And the flip side is true. Then if the right to vote is denied or abridged in particular communities, leaders are not accountable to those communities. And we see the impacts of that lack of accountability in our cities right here in Missouri, right here in St. Louis, and across the nation. Communities that get overlooked and get ignored because they don't have a voice to speak. And so the right to vote is not only about acknowledging the basic human dignity of all people to have a say in their own destinies, in their own futures, in things that affect their family and children, but also that they have a right to hold their elected officials accountable for the things that they need to make their communities a better place. Truly, the fight for the right to vote is how, in my view, the path that we take to strive for the beloved community. Because until all voices can be heard, we can't get there. And we know that faith organizations have been at the forefront of this fight, even now. So I'm currently doing work with the Brennan Center for Justice, which is a leading voting rights organization around the country. I'm their lead legislative advisor in Georgia. And you may have seen Georgia in the news lately. They recently passed a massive voter suppression bill. And we see here, just days after that bill was passed, again, it was communities, faith communities, that stepped up to the plate and brought lawsuits challenging it. And right here in Missouri, faith leaders have also stepped up to the plate to support this effort. We had a statewide voting rights lobby day a few weeks ago on March 31st. And you could see there, well, that's Rod Chappell, the president of the NAACP, talking. You see right behind him, Reverend Darrell Gray of the Missouri Progressive Missionary Baptist State Convention. You can, and here's a few other photos from that event. That speaking is Minority House Leader, Representative Crystal Quaid. And here is the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, Ashley Bland Manlove. And right behind her, you can see Cheryl Adelstein with the Jewish Community Relations Council. There were faith leaders galore present that day from many different faiths. And only a few of them you can see up here on this stage, but I do have to give a shout out to Reverend Dr. Cassandra Gould, the president of Missouri Faith Voices, who is recovering from a car accident, wasn't able to be up on that stage, but she was there and she testified on those bills. And so I say this to say that to acknowledge, recognize, and thank the role that faith communities play in this work, in Jewish communities in particular. In the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, we meet, and I'm going to show you, we meet every Monday at 10 a.m. And we have a listserv that you can get on. I'm going to put a link in the chat on how you can get onto it, but you can also get onto it by texting MOVPC to 66866, and you'll be on the list. And our current partners in the Jewish community include, we have representatives from Sher Emeth who attend every week, representatives from Temple Israel who attend every week, representatives from the National Council of Jewish Women, from the Jewish Community Relations Council, folks from the ADL often join. And so it really is, some folks from Matovu sometimes come. So it really is a terrific engagement every Monday. These are just additional photos from the Voting Rights Lobby Day. I will note that that Lobby Day did make national news. National Public Radio sent Pam Fessler to Missouri to cover that Voting Rights Lobby Day, and it did appear on National Public Radio. But getting down to brass tacks here, I want to share with you a couple of the bills that we are tracking, and these are pretty relevant since the biggest two that we are tracking are actually having a hearing tomorrow. So this tonight's event is very, very timely. We have a spreadsheet. It's called the Voting Rights, the Missouri Voting Rights Tracker. That spreadsheet is available online. It's available to anybody. It is an open access spreadsheet that we update with every new development on the bills that we're tracking. And this is just an example. I took a screenshot of it a couple weeks ago, but you can see it includes an actual hyperlink to the bills themselves. It lists the sponsor of the bill. It kind of indicates, what is this bill about, right? So House Bill 334 is a photo ID bill. And then it includes some talking points about what the bill actually does. It includes a column that states whether the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is supporting or opposing that bill. It includes the current status, and it also includes links to written testimony that we have submitted either for or against this legislation. So it's a really great resource to stay on top of the bills, because it's very hard to stay on top of the morass of legislation. You know, there were over 30 voting bills introduced in the Missouri General Assembly, but only a handful of them are actually moving. So this is a really good way to stay up to date with that. And here's really kind of the landscape of what we are tracking. I will note at the outset that the fight for more accessibility in voting is not lost on some Missouri lawmakers. In fact, there were the majority of the voting bills filed were bills that would make voting more accessible by modernizing voter registration, by allowing no excuse absentee voting, by ensuring people in jails have access to absentee ballots. But unfortunately, none of those bills have had a hearing or moved. The bills that are moving are bills that would make voting more difficult. So I'm going to share with you the top couple bills that we are tracking. And these include measures that would enshrine photo ID requirements, yet again, measures that would make it easier to purge voters from the rolls, measures that make the citizen initiative process more difficult. And we're even tracking protest bills as part of our effort, along with a broader coalition of Missouri groups. And while those protest bills would fall, you might think, fall into the category of criminal justice reform, they have an impact on voting, because one of the things they do is increase penalties for offenses that people commonly get at protests, like, say, blocking traffic, and turn those from misdemeanors into felonies. And in Missouri, if you have a felony conviction, even if you're not in prison, if you are on probation or parole, you still can't vote. And so these bills would have the effect of not only impeding the ability to protest at that moment, but also have long-term effects on the rights of these very same people to make their voices heard later on. And so I'm going to go through our top 5 bills very, very quickly, and then we can have some questions. But I want to share with you where these things are at. Number 1, House Bill 334. This is the photo ID bill. This has passed the House, and it is going to be heard in the Senate tomorrow at 1 p.m. There is still an opportunity for you to either attend and testify or to submit testimony online. I will share with you a link on how you can do that. And here's in essence what this bill would do. In short, it eliminates many forms of identification that voters can currently use to vote, leaving only a state-issued photo ID. And quite nefariously, it also eliminates the Secretary of State's obligation to notify voters about voter ID rules. So you're going to take away forms of ID that people have come to rely on, and then eliminate the responsibility of the Secretary of State to notify and educate voters about that. And here's a visual of what this would do. Right now, all of these forms of ID that you see on the screen, we can use to vote. You can use a driver's license or a non-driver's license, but you can also use that voter identification card you get from the election authority. That would be eliminated under this bill, as would a student ID from a college or university in Missouri, or another government document that's current, that has your name and current address on it. In other words, leaving just that kind of ID that you have to get at the DMV. And that's really where the problem with these laws lies. First, for many people, it may be difficult to even get to a DMV. Not every county in Missouri has a DMV office. And so for some people, they would have to travel 40, 50, 60 miles or more to get to the nearest DMV. And if you don't have a car, that's difficult to do. Speaking of which, many DMVs are not on public transportation routes, because again, their primary job is to give people driver's licenses, not to provide identification to vote. But we know that an enormous swath of people who don't have one of these forms of ID are people that don't have driver's licenses because they don't drive. On top of that, many DMV offices close at 4:30 in the afternoon, are not open evenings and weekends. So if you're a low-wage worker, you'd have to actually take a day off without pay to get there. And that's before you get to the underlying documents that you need to procure a state ID, like a certified birth certificate. And I mean the kind that has that raised seal on it. And some of you may have yours. I happen to have mine only because my mother is incredibly organized. Some of you, I know many of you know my mom, Joy, and she's organized and saved everybody's birth certificate. So I do have one. Many people don't. Many people may have had those documents destroyed at some point. It can be difficult to get replacements. And many people have errors on those underlying documents, or perhaps their name has changed since birth. Women are disparately impacted by these laws, and they would have to produce a paper trail of legal documents showing how they got from A to B. For people who have errors or omissions on those underlying documents, it can be very difficult to get them without going through a tremendous hassle. We know, for example, voters of color who are senior citizens may not have even been born in a hospital. In the days of segregation, many African Americans were not welcomed at area hospitals. Their more common practice was to be born at home to a midwife, and maybe you wrote the information in a Bible. And so for these people, they're going backwards decades later to get a post-dated birth certificate that may or may not be accurate. I've had clients who have had just minor discrepancies in how a name is spelled on the birth certificate compared to how the name is spelled on their voter registration compared to how their name is spelled with the DMV. And they had to go to like 10 different government offices to reconcile all of that, sometimes even having to go to court and get a court-ordered legal name change to make all those match. That's the reason that these kinds of laws can be burdensome for voters when we eliminate forms of identification that people may have. And it's also why these laws tend to disparately impact voters of color. African Americans are 2 times as likely to lack a non-expired state ID compared to white voters. And young voters, low-wage workers, voters with disabilities who don't drive, seniors whose IDs are expired are also disparately impacted. Here in Missouri, the Secretary of State did a study as part of our lawsuit we filed a couple years ago. They ran the numbers. We have a list of registered voters, and we have a list of people in Missouri who have IDs on file with the Department of Motor Vehicles. They ran that list. More than 200,000 valid voters in Missouri did not have a non-expired ID on file with the Missouri Department of Revenue. So again, this bill is up for a hearing in the Senate Elections Committee tomorrow at 1 p.m. People can testify in person. I'm going to be there in person, but you can also submit testimony online. Also being heard tomorrow is another bill, House Bill 738. It has those very same photo ID requirements I just went over, but it has a bunch of other stuff as well. Among other things, it would require, it would get rid of electronic voting machines that could make it difficult for certain voters with visual impairments to cast a secret ballot. They'll have to get assistance and have somebody read them the ballot. After this, it would make voter registration harder for groups like, say, the Legal Women Voters that do a lot of voter registration. They wouldn't be able to pay any of their staff to use that staff time to do voter registration. It would make it easier to purge the voter rolls. And it has a confusing provision about absentee voting. This bill would allow no excuse absentee voting, which is great. We like this. We want this. Missouri needs it desperately. In fact, Missouri is in the minority around the country. 34 states plus the District of Columbia already allow any voter to vote absentee without providing a reason to the government. Missouri does not. In Missouri, to vote absentee, you have to present one of 6 excuses that you can't go to the polls on election day. So we definitely need no excuse absentee voting. Election officials prefer it. It makes it easier for them to process ballots. But if you actually look at the fine print on this bill, it's got a lot of caveats and it doesn't really do what it says. So first, it only allows no excuse absentee voting if you show up to vote in person at the election board during early voting. It would not allow people who need to get that absentee ballot in the mail to do so without providing an excuse. And so think about who needs to get these ballots in the mail. Seniors, voters with disabilities, low-wage hourly workers who maybe can't get off work before 5 p.m. to show up at the election board and cast that ballot in person. And none of those things, being old, having a disability, or having to work, are not reasons that you can vote absentee in Missouri. And so this would leave out the people that actually really most need to get access to an absentee ballot. It also sneakily cuts the absentee voting period in half. It's currently 6 weeks. It would go down to 3 weeks. And it has a little provision that says, plus, if the photo ID part of the law gets struck down in court, I don't know, maybe we might file a lawsuit challenging it again, then the no excuse absentee voting part goes away too. So that's the reason we have opposed this legislation. Again, these 2 bills are being heard tomorrow in the Senate Elections Committee at 1 p.m. Finally, I want to also point out Senate Bill 282. This one has passed out of committee. It is on the calendar for perfection in the Senate. They could take it up any day. It pretty much does exactly what we've already talked about. It has that strict photo ID requirement, and it has that identical confusing absentee voting requirement. And so the ask here is for people to call their senators and let them know how you feel about that. Finally, the final 2 bills I'm going to touch on relate to the initiative petition process. These bills, HJR 20 and House Bill 333, have the effect of making it more difficult, especially for grassroots organizations, to bring ballot initiatives to the public by several things. It increases the number of signatures you'd have to get a measure on the ballot, and it increases the threshold to pass. Right now, you only need 50%. If you get a majority, it passes. This would increase that to 2/3, which is really, really hard to get. This is a really important piece of the puzzle, especially in a state like Missouri that is so heavily gerrymandered. And what I mean by that is that our district lines are drawn in a way right now that benefit incumbents. And as a result, the makeup of the Missouri legislature does not tend to reflect truly the will of Missouri's voters. And that's one reason that voters have taken to the ballot initiative process. And you've seen things, for example, like Missouri voters voted overwhelmingly, almost 2/3, to raise the minimum wage, voted by similar measure to defeat right to work provisions, to enshrine medical marijuana. And so you see that disconnect, right? Those are all measures that the Missouri legislature would have never even considered. That's why the ballot initiative process is an important part of the checks and balances. Yet these measures would make that process harder. These have passed. They passed last week out of the Senate Elections Committee, so they could also be up for a vote anytime. And that is why there is actually a lobby day tomorrow that we are co-sponsoring. That is going to take place at the Capitol to uplift the importance of the ballot initiative process in this effort. So I'll be going to that to be part of the lobby day, and then I'm going to stay and testify for those bills. I want to conclude, before I conclude, I want to sort of speak to what's happening at the national level, because you can see here our work plan sort of covers a wide range of efforts. And it's important to note that there is legislation pending at the federal level that would go a long way to blocking these bills that we just looked at in Missouri, as well as many of these voter suppression measures that are happening across the country. And the first one is the For the People Act. You may have heard about it. You may have seen things about it on TV. It passed out of the House of Representatives on March 3rd. It was introduced in the Senate as S1 on March 17th, and it's had several hearings in the Senate. Stacey Abrams testified last week at one of those hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And it is really transformative. I want to give a shout out to two members of Missouri's congressional delegation, St. Louis Congresswoman Cori Bush and Kansas City Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, who both signed on as co-sponsors of this bill in Congress. And here's what it would do. It includes a whole package of reforms that would make voting easier. It also has an entire package of reforms that would enshrine campaign finance reform and end dark money in politics. And then third, it has a whole package of reforms that would mandate nonpartisan redistricting commissions to halt some of that gerrymandering that has made the landscape so skewed. And just take a look at how it would change things in Missouri. It's literally a game changer in Missouri. I will say that many of the measures in this bill are measures that are already being successfully implemented in states around the country, but not here, because Missouri is very, very much behind the times compared to other states when it comes to our voting laws. So for example, the For the People Act would ensure restoration of voting rights after you've been released from prison. As I mentioned, here in Missouri, you continue to be ineligible to vote during any period of probation and parole, no matter how long that is. I challenged a similar law in Louisiana, and I had a client who was convicted of like a drug crime when he was 17 years old. My client was 65 years old when I brought that case several years ago, was a deacon in his church, was on his school's PTO, just a pillar of the community, and had never, ever once in his life been able to cast a ballot until we worked to get that law changed. The For the People Act would also modernize voter registration by incorporating it into existing transactions that you may undertake with other government agencies. We are in the 21st century, y'all. We have the internet. These databases can actually talk to each other. And so it would automate the process once you go to, say, the DMV or social services agency of updating your voter registration information. We don't do that currently in Missouri. 22 states do, though, and it works really well. And what has been found in states like Georgia, Oregon, Washington is not only does it dramatically increase the numbers of people who are registered, it also increases turnout, particularly among Black and Brown communities who face the greatest barriers to registration. It would enshrine early voting. We don't have early voting in Missouri. It would guarantee voting by mail. One thing I didn't mention, House Bill 738 expressly prohibits voting by mail, except in those 6 circumstances. It would prohibit those strict photo ID mandates that we have to spend thousands of hours every single year fighting here in Missouri. It would make Election Day a federal holiday. And these are just a few of the things it would do. And you can see here that how dramatically it would change the state of play here in Missouri. And that's one reason that across the country, polling shows that this legislation is widely supported by Democrats and Republicans alike. A majority of voters, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, support this legislation. And there's the more nitty-gritty of the polling data. But this is not all. It is complemented by a second bill called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This bill has not yet been introduced. It's going to be introduced in the summertime. But it is a critical piece of legislation that would restore the full power of the Voting Rights Act to block racially discriminatory voting laws. And this part of the Voting Rights Act was struck down in 2013 in a Supreme Court decision called Shelby v. Holder. And since then, we've seen just an escalation in discriminatory voting measures that not only would have been blocked under the Voting Rights Act, but in fact wouldn't have even been introduced at all because lawmakers knew that it wouldn't pass pre-clearance. It wouldn't pass muster under the Voting Rights Act. This bill that just got passed in Georgia, lawmakers would not have spent the time to promulgate that piece of legislation if this provision of the Voting Rights Act was in place, because they would know that it wouldn't pass. So to uplift the attacks on the right to vote, but really uplift the opportunity for transformative voting reform that is happening at the national level, there is a National Day of Action on Saturday, May 8th. And I recognize it is on Shabbat, and I'm sorry for those of you that observe. Everything will be recorded, and there'll be opportunities to view things afterwards. This is a national date, and here in Missouri, we didn't have any ability to sort of muck with the date. It also happens to be the birthday of Ahmaud Arbery, who was one of the many unfortunate victims of a state-sponsored police shooting. So, and it's really going to be, uplift the opportunity of grassroots communities to have their voices heard. There are going to be 4 events in the state of Missouri, including right here in St. Louis. The St. Louis event will start at Sumner High School and will include a press conference. Mayor Tashara Jones has agreed to speak at the press conference. It will then be followed by a votercade where you're in your car and you got like signs on your car, and we'll go around that neighborhood, ending back at Tandy Park, which is right across the street from Sumner High School, where there will be a celebration village that will include teach-ins, some music. There'll be food trucks there. There'll be activities for kids. The election board today even just agreed to have voting machines there and so that people can practice using that. So I encourage all of you to get involved in one form or another. If you can't come to these things in person, there will be online opportunities for all of them. And to learn more, I would encourage you to join one of the upcoming weekly Monday meetings of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. We have different guests each week, and it's always a wonderful and dynamic conversation. It's a great way to start the week. You sort of get really inspired by seeing that people all across the state, and we usually have around 100 people on these calls every week, are all there to uplift the right to vote. And it's really an inspiring time. So we'll stop there. And hopefully that covered all of the details of the things that you were hoping to get, Chris.